Hi, I'm David Chapman, and I'm here to talk to you about the commercial lease. Commercial leases are a little different than residential leases, and so we want to just talk about, pay special attention to some of those differences. But let me start out and just tell you sort of what the pieces are to the commercial lease that we want to make sure there are the essential elements, if you will, of these leases. First of all, the parties. And one of the things I want you to make sure of when you do these commercial leases is check the title by going to the county assessor and finding out who the actual owner is of the property, and use the entity that's owning the particular space that's being rented, or a property manager company to do this. So that would be the owner, and then we want the tenant, the name of the business of the tenant, and if they're personally guaranteeing the space, then you want to also put their name on the lease as well to personally guarantee it. Then we go for the premises or the space. This is done with a legal description of the property, and many times it's a suite number, or it needs more information than just an address and a property description, because it may be broken down into a smaller unit that's being rented. So you want to make sure you cover that adequately. And then we have the consideration of the rent, and we're going to talk about that in a minute in a little bit more depth. You have the term and the renewal options, which is sometimes a little different than residential, because these leases typically are longer in length, and they'll have renewal periods. We'll talk about that again too. Assigning and subletting is fairly common in commercial leases, so there'll be clauses in there regarding that. Signage, hold harmless claims, insurance claims are covered in these leases. Parking, common areas. So there's a lot of different elements like that that we want to have in here that we're going to go over briefly. And so let's get started and talk about rent. So in commercial leases, we have considerations we don't have in residential that I think are worth talking about. And one of them is rent increases. Rent, because these leases are frequently for extended periods, I mean, they could be at least 3, usually 5, maybe 7, could be 20 years. The landlord attempts to offset the burden of inflation, particularly in time periods like we're in today with high inflation, by structuring the structured rental increases at prescribed intervals. And so there are different ways of doing this. In other words, you can go up a dollar per square foot per year automatically if you want, or you could negotiate an increase every 3 years based on some kind of an index, the consumer price index, or the LIBOR, or some other type of public index that's researchable that everybody knows about. So there's no confusion over how much that lease would go up or down, I suppose, given at the 3-year period, the 2-year period, however you wanted to work that. But the point is, you've got to protect yourself in these commercial leases because the leases are longer, and just things happen during a longer time frame, like inflation, increases in utilities, all property taxes, all those things. You need to protect yourself, and you do that through rent increases. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one's pass-through provisions. Typically an office will have a provision which the landlord will pay expenses up to agreed amount, or there'll be a pass-through provision on expenses. So up to the point where the landlord pays a certain amount of utility expense or insurance expense or some other expense, then the tenant starts paying for those. So we've literally passed those through to the tenant. So in that, then the landlord pays it and it's passed through to the tenant. We call those pass-through provisions, and those would have to be identified in a lease. The base rent will also be identified in this. When we do that, typically in a commercial lease, we've got to identify whether we're doing net usable area, net rentable area, the different types of measurement of space. So how is it that we determine how much space they're renting? What measurement did we take? Did it include common space? Did it not include common areas? And then that price per square foot then is multiplied by the space that they're actually occupying. So that has to be identified very clearly in the lease, the method in which we measured the space, and then the price rent per square foot that they're going to be paying, and then it's calculated. Another one that sometimes we see in commercial leases, particularly in malls, is a percentage rent. In a percentage rent, the landlord gets a percentage of the gross sales of the tenant. That can be very complicated, but it can also be very advantageous, because then the landlord has some skin in the game to keep up the facility or to keep traffic consistent to the facility. Anything that they're sort of in charge of or that they're accountable to, sometimes percentage rents make a lot of sense, and you know, retail is the one that comes to mind there. Common area maintenance, we call these CAM expenses. So common area maintenance would be stuff like big atriums, common bathrooms, parking lots, entries, all kinds of things that are used in common by all tenants. They need to share in the cost of maintaining those. Those are called CAM fees. Those are generally as a price per square foot, so that the more space that you have, the more burden it would be on you to take care of the common areas that your employees or your customers use. That's called CAM, common area maintenance. Okay, so in general, there are a couple ways of paying rent, and it depends on who pays what. So we have something called a gross lease. In most office leases, the landlord pays all the expenses, even within the tenant's space. So this would include vacuuming, emptying waste, emptying ash, still routine maintenance throughout the whole place. And that's called a gross lease. So the only thing that the tenant pays for is rent. The landlord pays for everything else. Now there might be some pass-through provision, but everything else, everything is paid in that by the landlord. A different way of doing that is what we call a net lease. And a net lease indicates that the tenant pays at least something, okay? So in different parts of the country and in different industries, we define net leases differently. Just be sure and recognize that you know that under a net lease that the tenant pays at least something. So usually it's utilities, okay? It could be utilities maintenance, it could be utilities maintenance and taxes, it could be utilities maintenance, taxes, and insurance. So there are lots of things under a net lease general category that could be paid by the tenant. If the tenant pays all of the expenses with the exception of the mortgage and the principal, the payment, then we call that a triple net lease, a net lease, triple net lease. And so those are very common in places like Walgreens, CVS's. Just triple net leases are very common with nationwide chains, and they'll have local investors that provide the building and don't pay anything except for their payment, and then the tenant takes care of everything else. Okay, so another thing that you might find in there in a commercial lease that's a little bit different than, say, a residential lease, or provisions for auditing either the landlord's books or the tenant's books. So there might be some method that they might be able to take a look at each other's position to ensure that they're strong going forward, because there is great dependency and partnership between a landlord and an owner in a commercial lease. Okay, so those are some of the different ways and considerations when we talk about rent. Some other provisions that we would find in a lease, term and renewal options. Because it costs a lot of money for a big company or any company to move a commercial operation, many times they want a renewal option. So this would be a predefined way of negotiating an extension to the lease. So you may do a 3-year lease with a 2-year extension, and then that 2-year extension may be adjusted. The rate may be either negotiated at that time, or it could be pre-negotiated, and it could be some function or relationship to the consumer price index or LIBOR or some other way that you could determine what the new rate would be after the first term. So you've got to identify the current term, whether it's 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever, and then any renewal option that would go on from there. Another thing that needs to be addressed in this lease is the ability to assign or sublet the space. Particularly right now, after the pandemic, what we saw is we saw during the pandemic that everybody moved home to work. Now the pandemic is over, people are coming back to the workplace. When they come back to the workplace, not all of them are coming back, and they're coming back slowly. And so what we found is that most tenants don't require the space that they did before. If they have the ability in their lease to assign or sublet, what that means is that they could assign all, if they take all their space and they transfer it to somebody else, then that would be an assignment. They'd be assigning all of their space, and then somebody else would either share the liability for the payment or would take in the entire liability for the payment. That would be an assignment. Under a subletting, it's just a portion of the space. So maybe they only need half the space now for their employees, and the other half they're going to lease or sublease to a new tenant. Both of these, the assignment and subletting, would only be possibility if the lease allowed it and the landlord approved it. So that's why it needs to be in the lease, whether it's allowed or not. The next one that's huge in commercial is signage. Signage is important, particularly, well, really to any business, but particularly retail, people that need people to come to their offices. But even offices want signage to build their brand and other things. So you need to have a provision and some payment on who pays for the signage, what signage is allowed to go on the building, where it would be very specific conditions that apply to the sign and what it costs, where they can put signage. Lots of misunderstandings happen on the signage. You will want to have in there a hold harmless clause that holds the landlord harmless, and even requires the landlord to be put on the insurance policy as another named to prevent the liability to the landlord from the tenant. All right, and then that kind of gets us into insurance requirements. We require $1 million liability insurance with our tenants, so that, and then we ask them to name us as another insured on their policy as the landlord, and that's something that you might want to consider when doing a commercial lease. I think that makes a lot of sense. And also, you want to make sure as the landlord that they have and understand that you aren't able to and aren't liable for any of their stuff in the event of a fire or a flood or anything like that, and that they need renter's insurance on their policies. Okay, that kind of covers that part. Oh, parking. I think it's also important to talk about assigned apartment spots when we're talking about commercial leases, charges for parking, and understand the parking requirements legally for the use that they want. And I think the use of common spaces, the use of parking, and that thing needs to be very, very clear. They need to understand what their obligations are inside the suite, what they're able to do and not able to do. And while we're talking about that, let me say a little bit about building TIs, or tenant improvements. In these commercial leases, we're typically going to give them at least some money to do some tenant improvements to the facility. Those might be paint, carpet, flooring. There's a lot of things that they could do specifically that they need for their application. These are good negotiation things for a landlord, and I'll tell you why I like them. If it's something that could be retained after the tenant leaves, then it's actually building value into your building. If it's not something that any other tenant could ever use and they're going to have to be destroyed or removed when they leave, it doesn't add value to your building. So when negotiating these things, always consider what does this do to the value of my building going forward after this tenant? Could any of that be retained or not? And then that will tell you maybe how much of the tenant improvements you can share as the owner of the building. Okay, so just wanted to say something about that. What are the tenant obligations and what are the landlord obligations for any type of maintenance inside the building once you get those TIs completed? Because if you're going to have responsibility for the maintenance of their tenant improvements, then you ought to have some say on how those tenant improvements are actually constructed. There are other things that need to be in there, like condemnation and hazardous materials in the building and stuff like that, that you need to make sure that they don't have. You need to have in there a landlord's right to entry. I would do at least a 24-hour term in there to where you have 24 hours upon notice to enter unless there's an emergency, and then you could have the right to entry immediately. I want to talk about, just say something about non-complete clauses. I've run into this a lot in the way of retail. And sometimes it comes, I'll give you an example. I was working with a tenant who was working with a jean manufacturer. So she was going to sell jeans, a certain brand name. And they had a requirement that nobody else within a 5-mile radius that sold those jeans, she could put her office within 5 miles of those people. So I had to all of a sudden know about jeans and know who sold jeans and make sure that we have a non-compete there with anybody else in our place, and that people know that. So a non-compete would be a situation where no other, you are obligated not to take a lease from anybody else that would compete against them in certain categories. You need to be very clear what those are when you do non-competes in retail. Like it's probably reasonable that you would agree that you won't put another coffee shop in the same strip center. Items like that would be a non-compete clause. Broker's commission. Always be very clear who's getting paid in the transaction and transparent on what's getting paid. Also be very transparent about ownership of things. If you're particularly if you're a realtor, a real estate agent, or a licensed real estate professional, be sure and disclose that in your lease. The last thing I want to talk about is just because leases are complicated and long, sometimes it's behooves you to do a letter of intent. So a letter of intent would be significantly shorter. It's a non-binding document that would outline the terms to see if you're close enough into agreement to actually go to a lease. I recommend LOIs, letter of intents, just to keep you from spending the time of getting to a lease if the rate isn't appropriate or the initial things. You can get into the details in the lease, but make sure that all the big stones are covered in a letter of intent, and then that will sometimes get you to be able to go to lease. So that kind of gives us just a brief outline of the commercial lease process.